Hello and welcome to today's Planter Session webinar. My name is Mark Hadley and we're here today for Building the Evangelism Machine, and brought to you by Geneva Push. I'll be your moderator today, which means basically I'll be responsible for any technical hang-ups that happen, so please be patient with us. Occasionally these things can happen when we're dealing with the internet. Throughout our presentation, we want to encourage you to interact with our speakers by typing in questions using the question pane you'll find on your control panel. We'll be answering questions live straight after the initial interview, so make sure you get yours in early. We usually have a pile of them stacking up, so if you want to think any time along during the interview something occurs to you, use the question pane, send it, I'll save them, and I'll hand them on to our speakers. Also, we're recording today's session, and we'll make the link available about 24 hours after the event via email. So look out for that interview too. It also gives you an opportunity to review what you might hear and think to yourself, oh, there was something that I really wanted to follow up later, so there's an opportunity again. But before we get underway, we'd like to thank EA Insurance for making this webinar possible. If you haven't sorted out the insurance side of church planning, then we'd like to recommend that you start with a chat with EA. They can help you sort out everything from public liability to building, property and contents insurance, as well as probably let you know about a lot of the issues you haven't even thought of yet. So ea.org.au is a good place to start. Now let's get on to our host. Our host today is Mikey Lynch. Mikey works for AFES, but more importantly for our purposes, he's also a founding director of Geneva Push. He's a church planner in his own right, brings a lot of experience to the table, and he'll be handling our interview today. G'day, Mikey.
Thanks. Hi, everyone, and a special shout out to the Hobart-based MTS apprentices who happen to be listening into this webinar in the other room. So, hey, guys. I just heard a little Craig Dobbie is our interview subject today. Craig was the second employed staff member at EV Church soon after it was planted many years ago now on the Central Coast of New South Wales. Originally as it was just in the areas of maturity and mission. Is that right, Craig?
Yeah, that's right, Mikey.
Yep, and now you oversee that mission purpose with team and staff, volunteers and all sorts of different activities across the whole of EV. Is that right?
Lots and lots of stuff happening, yeah, that's right. And thanks for the comment about a long time ago. Yeah, it feels like a long time ago.
Excellent. It's really great to have you with us, Craig. And I'm going to ask you a few questions just to get the ball rolling. But in many ways, the real value of these come from the questions that the listeners send in. So hopefully we can stir them up to some good questions, huh?
Looking forward to it. Be great.
Fantastic. So we've got you in because you're our guru, right? You guys at EV Church are the geniuses who get everything perfect, and if we just plug into a webinar from you, you'll give us the mojo to do it perfectly. Is that why we've got you?
Oh, I think you've nailed it, yeah. All geniuses, all intellectual giants. Yeah, you've nailed it there.
But seriously, I mean, it wasn't all perfect. How did you actually begin in the whole ministry at EV? What did it look like in those early days, many moons ago?
Well, look, speaking for myself, it was really a matter of trial and error. We're just bozos like everybody else, to be honest. We began, I think, doing the same sort of things that most other people begin doing in church. And the fact of the matter was, I think I began 17 years ago doing Stephen Abbott's Everyday Evangelism, which I think is still a great series of training courses. We did Christianity Explained. We taught people how to do 2 ways to live. We did all those sort of things that I think many of us are still aiming to do, and we're still aiming to do.
Excellent. What were some of those things, as things were getting off the ground, though, that you were doing as you were thinking that all through? What was the, you say trial and error. Is that like you'd sit back and debrief and kind of say what worked, what didn't work, all that kind of business?
Well, I think we tried a few. We tried a few things. We did one-to-one evangelism in my lounge room. We'd meet mission contacts. We'd run special Sundays where we got Chapo or someone else like Ray Galea perhaps to come up and preach, or Al Stewart. There were contacts that came out of that. I met with them one-to-one and we evangelised them, and some people were converted. We had a couple of other things running at the time. We began very early in the piece. In fact, the very first year we began, we ran an urban mission, which is like a beach mission, just not at the beach. And we had a team of perhaps 25 or less than that, and we had a number of kids come along, and they were really the things we did in the early days, apart from training the Christians.
Yep. Yep. You when we were chatting the other day about all of this and working out how to tackle the interview, you mentioned that one of the things, but I don't know whether you felt it at the time, but at least as you look back, you realise how much the unique ministry and gifts that Andrew Hurd brought into the mix, how that actually benefited your ministry as the mission guy. Do you want to kind of unpack a little bit of that reflection about how, in some ways, you were building off of that kind of preaching ministry?
Yeah, I guess as we've reflected on it, it's a bit ground war and air war. You know, it's you want to move people to think differently about life, and the pulpit ministry I think, is a massive part of that. You can do a bunch of things down in the trenches with people, but unless Sunday by Sunday, Saturday by Saturday, week by week, as you consider the scriptures together, unless you're winning the war of helping people think differently about life, and the majority of that, of course, is taking place in the pulpit, I don't think you'll get, you won't get the wins you'd like to get. I think Andrew, we've got a preaching team at EV now, but I think, to my mind, the key in all of that is it's preaching that actually tackles people's worldview.
And that's going to help you both with that's going to help your Christians, isn't it, in terms of helping them realise why evangelise, as well as help the non-Christian who's sitting in on church, and for them to have those underlying assumptions challenged. Is that kind of what you're talking about there?
Well, it's certainly both those things. It's a bit like the Keller thing of, you want to preach like the non-Christian people are there, and if you are doing that, sooner or later they will be there. I think there's an important truth in that, but equally, you do want to do something with the Christian. You do want to radicalise them to think differently about life, because the gospel is calling us to a radically different life. It's just that many times Christians have come to us or come from elsewhere or grown up without really taking on the implications of the gospel and thinking about it as radically as we need to. And I think certainly in the early days, and still, Andrew has sought to preach in a way that shaped people's worldview. It's my contention that's what we want to be doing. That's certainly what I'm trying to do in the pulpit.
And that's hence that gesture on that image we have of you on the slide there. That's a worldview preaching gesture, is it? Can we get that image back there? Look at that.
Wow.
That's worldview shaping right there.
Whatever it is.
Whatever it is. Hey, just on that, just to probe just a little further. So your observation is, as the evangelist, it's easier to get that mission stuff happening in all the one-to-one and the evangelistic courses. You actually can do that better if you have a particular kind of preaching ministry that you're working in synergy with. Is that right? Whereas if you took that preaching out, it would be much harder as a grassroots evangelist in a church to get the same momentum going. Would that be a fair statement?
Look, I think it's definitely the case. I think it sets a tone for what we as a church are about, what Jesus is about. I think it radicalises people. I was speaking to a bloke just the other night. He's come through the life course we've run recently. He went to it as a guy who's come from a nearby church, and he came telling me how very good he thought the church was that he came from. And I must say, with all deference to him, I did think it had a number of major doctrinal issues that were not good. I think he's come through that, and he's thinking already, and he's been with us, I guess, now 3 months, thinking very differently about Christian life, at least in observable things. And I'm thinking that it is the case that if people stick with us for 3 months, longer than that, of course, I think they begin to see there's something more about life that they haven't really tapped into, and that's a major win. It's a major goal of the pulpit ministry.
If people wanted to get a taste of the kind of preaching Craig's talking about, they can just jump onto the evchurch.info, and you can find a bunch of Andrew and Craig's sermons there to get a sense of what this worldview preaching thing looks like. That is right, isn't it? evchurch.info, is that where we can find you guys online? Yeah.
That's it. And just to comment on that, Mikey, I think we're indebted to the legacy we got. I think Andrew would say that, and I certainly would say that when we were at University of New South Wales, my diet was listening to Philip. And I'd only just become a Christian when I was at University of New South Wales. So Philip Jensen there did something radical as far as I was concerned. So every week when I would go to campus Bible study, I'd have my world reshaped in some way. And I think it's been Andrew's conviction that's the kind of thing he's wanted to reproduce. It's been so formative for all of us.
So you can listen there for some examples to that, or even check out some of Philip Jensen's preaching, even those old sermons I think you can now get off his website. But the other take-home there is if you're the keen evangelist, you want to make sure you're building a good partnership with the pulpit ministry, even as you go about your ministry. Let's move on a second to thinking through. So you started like everyone else. You trial and error, urban mission, one-to-one evangelism, courses off the shelf. And yet, as we look in from outside on what's going on now and what you're caught up in on the Central Coast, there seems to be a great momentum happening there. And presumably there were things that you and your team did together to build up a head of steam so that the things that were happening happened more rather than dissipated. Could you kind of maybe look back and share with us what were some of those things that helped build up a head of steam in terms of evangelism?
Yeah, the historical perspective actually matters, I think, immensely, because it gives you a sense of where we've come from and how we've arrived there. It actually isn't that we're geniuses at all. It's just, in the early days we had Summerfest, an urban mission that was going. We were doing some evangelism one-to-one. But I think what we realised was we needed something in place, and it was really Andrew's insight, not mine. We needed something in place on a regular basis during the course of the year that gave an expectation that the evangelistic conversation that I was involved in, or the average punter in church was involved in, had an opportunity to go somewhere. Actually, let me express that a bit more clearly. You can do that by having a guest preacher come at regular intervals during the course of the year, but the problem with that is the average punter in church doesn't know much about the guest preacher who's coming. And so the question for them is, will they risk their social capital to invite someone? Our observation was not. Some of the guys we thought were magnificent preachers that would come, and we'd find it was a Sunday service which was actually less well attended than our regular ones, and it was a matter of confidence for the Christian would they invite their friends. We actually therefore began a regular cycle of an evangelistic event that we ran within church, which we now call Life. And our desire was to do it as well as we could, so we won the confidence of the Christian to invite their friends to it.
Now, that's a really helpful observation, the relational capital one. I mean, I think I've found a lot more when I was at uni. You're meeting so many people all the time, and you had so much time with them that you could invite them to stacks and stacks of stuff because you're seeing them every day at uni. Whereas now, when I think about inviting a friend at the school gate who I maybe see, once a week, so what's that, less than 40 times a year, any one invite I send to them is going to be a real risk for me now. I know them less well, I see them less often, and so you mentioned that social capital thing. That ties into it, I guess, one of those obstacles that Christians have. Is that right? In their heads and their hearts, there are these obstacles that you need to identify to go, like a uni student may invite them to lots of things, but someone at a different stage of life, there's these barriers that when to deal with. So confidence is one. Are there other barriers like that you've identified, that you've worked at?
Well, it's worthwhile saying there, confidence stretches across a whole range of things. That is, if I invite a friend to church, will I be embarrassed? If I invite a friend to this evangelistic event or this evangelistic preacher, will I be embarrassed by that? So it was important for us to create something that had enough input for the Christian to be won to it, and enough confidence for them to then invite their friends to it. So we worked pretty hard at doing that, and I think we did it really well. But there were a number of other things that were confidence issues. That is, are people actually being converted? Ought I to risk myself in conversation because the average punter may think I often don't see much progress for the conversations I have. I'm not quite sure how to go about it. So are people being converted? Will I know the answers to the difficult questions if they ask them of me? Just a whole range of factors like that.
So you can do that through training or giving materials, through broadcasting testimonies, interviewing converts up the front. These sorts of things help overcome those barriers? Yeah,
we did lots of testimonies up front. In the early days, it wasn't people who were converted because we didn't have that many who were converted. It was just the reality. It was Christians who'd been to the event that we were running, and they began to see actually it was really good, and I learned a bunch of things that I hadn't realised, and I feel actually much more confident now about my own engagement in the gospel with non-Christian friends. So they were important things to win. The training thing is it's a catch-22. That is, if I'm scared about evangelism, I don't engage in it, and because I don't engage in it, I don't learn the kind of questions that non-Christian people are asking. Because I don't learn those questions, I never know how to answer them. Because I don't know how to answer them, I don't engage in those conversations. So, it's a vicious circle that you've got to break at some point, and there's one of the obstacles for Christians, which was a big one.
On the other hand, you also identified the obstacles or the steps that someone who's not a Christian has to go through. What are some of those steps, and why did that help to actually break that down into smaller steps?
Yeah, perhaps. Historically, that's a rather important thing. So that, it is the case that 30 or 40 years ago, even say 20 or 30 years ago in Australia, there was so much more of an assumption of the Judeo-Christian ethic in society, and so you really could see people converted and come to faith genuinely. In the case of a lunchtime, and I saw it a number of times on the campus of University of New South Wales, where I just evangelised people at lunchtime and had made a commitment to do that a couple of days a week because I wanted to get better at it and realised it was an important thing to do. People were genuinely converted in the space of a 1 hour conversation, and of course you do follow up with them. But I think it's nowhere near like that in the majority of cases today. Not that God can't do it, but that it infrequently happens simply because the assumptions about God, about Jesus, about sin, etc., don't exist in the population we're addressing today. And so you've got to build those over quite some time, which means it's more steps and they're smaller.
Yep. An example of one or two of those? What are some of those steps that you have to go through?
Well, as we, for example, had Summerfest, our urban mission, going early in the piece, we realised it would be logical to take the people whom we develop as contacts out of that and take them to a next step where they'll hear something more of the gospel. So we, in time, developed out of our January urban mission a January summer series where we'd address the big questions that we thought that the non-Christian world ought to be asking. In time, we actually realised far better to survey the non-Christian world in our community and find out, what are the big questions they're asking, or actually address a question to them, as we did this year: who do they think Jesus is, and seek to take their responses and engage with them. That was the next step that kind of came out of Summerfest, our urban mission. But obviously out of that, you then think, well, what's the next step that you can help a person come to? And so coming out of that, we ran our 6-week course, which really began as a 5-week course called Life, where we actually do get to sit down with people over a meal and talk about what the gospel actually means.
Yep.
But at risk of talking for too long, Mikey, what I realised out of that is what used to be a 7-week follow-up series, which was just for starters back in the 1970s and 80s, is not, in my opinion, 7 weeks anymore. It's just for us, it takes a very long period of time.
Now, a couple of things that have come in the gaps there, the little steps and the long time you've mentioned, but just one more thing before we move on to the next question is, it sounds to me like something that you guys did with some determination was do a couple of things over and over again, year after year, and the kind of almost the same thing again and again and again, whereas often what I see in churches is you try this year. This year we're doing dialogue dinners. Next year we're doing introducing God. Next year we're doing walk-up evangelism. Next year we're doing, it was sort of chop and change kind of a lot, different bits and pieces. So what's one of the reasons, that's made you guys sort of stick with the couple of things and just, you've mentioned the urban mission, you've mentioned this life course thing, what are some of the advantages of, and how do you know when to keep going with something if it doesn't work the first time?
Yeah, look, the last question is perhaps a tricky one, but the earlier question is an easy one. That is, why persevere with something over a period of time? Because we did see they bore fruit quite quickly. So we did, I think, we haven't changed our life course much over 10 or 15 years. We've tweaked it a bit. We've actually made it longer because people said they were disappointed when it was over. But we did find from early in the piece that they actually did begin to bear fruit. But it wasn't just that. It was the fact that you need to develop momentum in something before a Christian's confidence is won to it. So that if you bring in the next evangelistic speaker whom they actually don't know, even though you know them particularly well, the Christian won't necessarily have confidence in that. They will have confidence, however, if they see something that's run consistently and recognise, having been to it themselves, it's good and it actually is bearing fruit. Well, you'll win the confidence issue, which is so important to win. And the reality is there, rather unfortunately, Christians do at times walk by sight, not by faith. And so lacking confidence, you need to supply it.
Yep, that's good. Just a reminder to people listening in, we're going to be opening up for questions soon. So if something's been buzzing around in your head, type it in. You might have to kind of go across from the webinar viewer screen to the webinar control panel screen, type in your question, and it doesn't have to be about anything we've talked about up to this point. If you want to ask something else to do with mission that I haven't even mentioned, then you're more than welcome to say, actually, I don't want to talk about this at all. I want to talk about something else, and I'll happily let Craig answer that question too. So a final.
Strange right there, Mikey. I thought you were going to get me to talk about tax law or something like that.
Yeah, on this area of evangelism, that's right. Hey, the final topic I wanted to raise before we open it to questions is we were just talking about building momentum. What are the things you've noticed, by contrast, that slow down or dissipate, that lead to burnout or cooling off of missionary energy in a church context?
Well, you kind of hinted at one of those, Mikey. That is, you meet parents at the school gate. But there are cycles in life that change. So I came from a tertiary education environment. I went to university. Well, I found many of the guys who were trained when they were at university were fruitful when they were in the university context, but couldn't make the transition to the working context because they weren't able to think the principles. They thought a particular application of principles and then tried to apply that in the workplace and ground to a halt. There's a number of different transition points in life. So when you're a young parent, you'll meet, when you're single, you'll have lots of disposable time to hang out with mates and, you'll be playing sport and one thing and another. You'll stay up all night and you'll talk. Those days change. You get married, you then have kids, and you're in that kind of very fertile environment where you're making lots of new friends, but that time changes as well. And so the inability sometimes of Christians to adapt to that, and you need to help them through it and think through how in this new cycle of life that I'm in do I engage. There's a thing that dissipates, I think.
Just on that, what are some of the things that you've done to help, that season, the shift from university to young worker or young parent? Are there little tweaks there that you guys have been able to make that, as you look in on others, you say, you go, hang on, other churches haven't quite tweaked to that one yet. They're still running all their mission as if everyone was still 19 and studying undergraduate degrees?
Well, I say a lot of this is not rocket science. So, our night congregation are, they're a demographic which is largely 18 to 25. So we would train them in a particular way for the kind of conversations they'd have at university or at TAFE or in the working environment, get them to use their disposable time in a particular way, and they're very, very mission-oriented. Part of that comes, of course, through the pulpit ministry, but part of it comes through just modelling and example and illustration, and they have models who may copy, and we try to make those models as visible as we can to them. Similar thing for our morning congregations, who really are the Gen X or the boomers. You do want to be able to illustrate for them and train them and help them think through, how do I initiate a conversation if it's difficult? What are the skills that help a person to do that? What in essence makes a good conversational partner? And so, we've thought through some of those things and run those kind of training courses, but we've also developed people who, it's not just me, we want to develop a whole team of trainers.
Yep. Other things that lose momentum or dissipate momentum?
Yeah, I think the reality is you need to recognise that developing friendships takes time. So, there are various levels of friends that you have. There's a friend who, God forbid, doesn't know you're a Christian, and you want to change that. There's the friend who does know you're a Christian, but you haven't had ever any conversation about that. There's the friend who knows you're a Christian, you've had some minor conversation, you've had the extended conversation with another, you've had a deep conversation where there have been questions. That whole process of making new friendships takes time, and so you need to recognise that'll be the case. Maturing Christians so they've got enough confidence and conviction to engage in gospel conversations takes time. So we need to do that with our new converts and help them engage with their old friends from the earliest days they're converted. But it does take time. Things get old and tired, and they need to be repotted or recast. So, in time, the things we do, we ought not think they're the silver bullet. They're always going to work. You need to keep thinking, well, it's a different audience. It's a slightly different culture. How do we change it?
Great. Well, I'm happy to throw open to questions. So if the organisers can flick the first one my way, I'll throw it to Craig. 1 minute till Oh, here we go. First question is from Conan. What are the best ways of attractional evangelism when you're smaller? So you've got a smaller group, but you want to be bringing people into some kind of event. Any advice on how to make it work when you're smaller, Craig?
Yeah, well, I know Conan's set up there, I'm guessing at the Northern Lakes and north of us. So, when you're around the 100 kind of size, or perhaps, Conan, now you're around 150 or thereabouts. Big important things for us were to be actually visible in the community. And so we did carols outdoors by preference for that reason. We wanted to be visible. We wanted to make an impact and to be seen. And we wanted, whenever we had something on, to take every opportunity to make sure we publicised that. I think at one point Andrew was hoping that EV Church would be like the Bunnings of when you think about hardware, you think about Bunnings. When you think about church, you wanted people to think about EV. Now, of course, there's ways that you can do that. There's only so many things you can do because you've only got so much money to spend on publicity. But it really is maximising the benefit that you get out of, the very few events you can run when you're slightly smaller. Those are, like, for us, carols, Summerfest, Easter.
What are some of the advertising things that work? When you don't get heaps of money.
Yeah, well, we've begun now doing Facebook advertising. We've begun now to do Google ads, those kind of things.
Want good abs, come to EV Church.
Yeah, well, there's some marketing guru there. I know it's not me. There's some of the things that we've done, but we've certainly done print media and cards and those, so you put out the postcards and those kinds of things. I think many people are doing those things. It is the recognition, though, that those are shop front events, and so you do need to be talking to your congregation, or at least thinking with them, what are the things that we need to do when people are coming in so that we inspire confidence that this will be worthwhile risking your social capital to invite friends to. I think we've done that well over the years, which simply means maximising those few events that you do run, maximising the value in them.
Great. Lee's got a question. He says, what have been the benefits of producing your own course?
Yeah, well, good question. Yeah, because there are lots of courses out in the marketplace that I think the content is fantastic. The benefit perhaps of producing our own is just that people recognise that we own it. That is, they buy into it, I think, partly for that reason. Having said that, I'd be more than happy to run Christianity Explored or Simply Christianity. It isn't the course itself. I guess my point is there's lots of good courses. It's the way you implement that matters.
You used the word ecosystem when we were talking earlier, weren't you? That sense of it's a larger ecosystem in which the course thrives.
Yeah, I appreciate you raising that term because, it's worthwhile to go back to it. It is, people ask us, can you send us the Life series? And I say, can we talk about what you might do with something like that. And my point being, not that I want to play hard to get, it's just that it's not the course that you pick off the shelf that's going to do it for you. It's the environment, the ecosystem in which it operates. Will have everything to do with whether you under God, you see fruit or you don't see fruit.
Yeah, that's
that makes
great.
Sense?
Hey, yeah, Chris has got a question here. He's asking, how do you identify and train the gifted evangelist in your church? And if I could add to that just one other question, knowing a bit about your situation, how do you protect the evangelists so that they don't become growth group leaders? How do you identify, train, and protect your evangelists?
Yeah, to pick up the second part of that question, Mikey, the kind of people I need are often the kind of people that the maturing ministry, the growth group ministry needs as well. You can't evangelise well unless you grasp the Bible well and can communicate it well, and they're all the things that you need to lead a growth group. So, I think it is the case that we often exist needing the same sorts of people. What I've done over the years is I've tried whenever we've run a training event, whenever we've run a gospel event, like for us that'll be Summerfest, our summer series, Life, our kind of summer series survey events where we send people out to the community to go and talk to as many friends as you can and find out what they think about X. I've just kind of tried to note who are the people who readily engage in that and engage in it with some skill. And I've, as quick as I've been able to, and as readily as I've been able to, without them going some other direction, I've tried to recruit them and train them.
Yep.
Can I add to that, Mikey?
Yeah, go for it.
Can I add something to that? I reckon you've got to take people in hand and help them train others. That is, the proof that they've actually got it will be that they can communicate it to someone else. So, in more recent years, I'm recognising I don't want to be the bottleneck as the trainer. I want to produce a bunch of trainers.
Yeah. If I read you guys right, you don't overemphasize training courses and so on, but you try and do a lot more sort of on the job, in the trenches sort of training. Is that correct in terms of training evangelists and just members in the church generally? Your training is more integrated than just courses?
I think it's both, and to be honest, it's an insight about maturity. To be honest, how do people grow in Christian life? The word, of course, is foundational. But you come at the application of the word in lots of different ways, so that the actual doing of Christian ministry, the engagement in evangelism, the joy of seeking to discipline my life because I want to be fruitful for Christ, all that actually has a recursive impact on the heart. That means that I then internalise not just the skill involved in doing it, but the desire to do it. So, lots of our training, where we can, I think, is on the job. In fact, to make the point, if you do a training course and you don't implement it for 6 months, you're almost, but not quite, wasting your time. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to discourage there, but immediate positive reinforcement of what you learn is going to be much, much better.
Yeah, that's great. Ben wants to know what you do with those who are more quiet or reserved in their kind of temperament and personality type.
Yeah, look, it's a good question, because there are, we're not all the same. I remember Chapo saying, at least I hope I quote him fairly, that he didn't necessarily think he was an evangelist. He was just a guy who worked at it until he got good at it. I think that's the same for me. I had the option at one point to...
Although it's a little discouraging when John Chapman says he's not that good at evangelism, isn't it?
A little discouraging, but heartening, I guess, because he's a guy who did work at it, and was absolutely brilliant. So there's a role for all sorts of different people. You want to find different ways in which they can do that. So some people are just radically good inviters. They're not good at communicating the substance of the gospel, but they will take a chance and invite people. Sometimes just because they're, to be honest, some of them are just a little bit odd. They're not affected by the kind of negative impact that others might direct back toward them, they'll just go for it. And other people are much more thoughtful, much more careful, but they do communicate very slowly. I think there's recognising that evangelism is a process, and now a much longer one than ever before. It means there are different places you can find for people in the whole evangelistic network.
Yep. Hey, I'm going to throw in a bit of a curveball of my own, Craig, just to see if I can get you to say anything else that'll kind of pique people's questions. Have you looked in at all at anyone who's done the kind of missional gospel community style of evangelism, and what are your reflections there on pros and cons of that approach to building the evangelism machine?
Yeah, when you say that, are you thinking about the kind of stuff that might come out of a mercy ministry sort of idea?
Not necessarily a mercy ministries, but a community model of evangelism where your small group or gospel community is an evangelistic community that seeks to together engage with non-Christians in a holistic manner, and that that kind of, I guess, building off, say, the Steve Timmis kind of stuff in the UK, those sorts of things.
Look, I know Cole Marshall is a guy who's working toward that and keen to see that happen. And I know Steve Timmis, of course, has been working at it for a long time. I think perhaps the first thing to say would be, I don't think it's say to pick up Steve Timmis's model, I don't think it's an either or. That is, do I go for the intensive discipling small group ministry, or do I go for the attractional thing where I look to engage people in the bigger avenue of church as a whole? I think it's not an either or. You do both because there are great opportunities in both. But the second thing to note is, and this is perhaps me reflecting on my background, Cole Marshall and I both came out of Navigator's background. In fact, Cole's my first Bible study leader. The one thing I reckon I'd suggest about it is it's hard to get lots of good discipling leaders who can help their groups to really disciple well. In a small church, you can do that for a while. That is, you may have just some Bible study leaders who've been at it for 20 or 30 years and they are thoroughly mature, godly guys, and absolutely use them to disciple and form discipling communities. My observation, though, is as you grow larger, you find that process of growing good leaders takes a very long time, and this is perhaps me with my old maturing hat on, that is the maturity ministry hat on. It takes a long time to grow leaders like that, so I don't know that I could sustain an entire evangelistic ministry on that model for very long. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So again, it comes back to not the either or. You both have that kind of stuff, but also scaffolding that can allow less mature leaders to still have some influence while being less equipped and less mature.
Yeah, totally. I mean, as an example, I've been leading a Bible study group for many years, and I've just retired from it this year because I actually felt it was far better for the group that I did that, and far better for me because I'm dying. But I would think in all that time, I'm a pretty outgoing evangelist now. I'm a pretty confident evangelist, but I don't know that I moved them a long way in all that time. I worked at it really hard, very intentionally. They'll testify to the fact that I did urge them along a lot, but I wasn't able to shift lots of them a long way. And all that's to say, some people are just of that personality where they are thoroughly good servants, wonderfully so, but their capacity to evangelise and to actually initiate lots of evangelistic conversation is quite limited. And these guys are people who did see people converted, wonderfully so. They worked with the very close friends they had. But it's just the fact that we're dealing with a whole range of people in our churches. And I'd just suggest by way of, just a figure which I've not pulled out of the air, I have thought about, but I would think that in our morning congregations, maybe 40% of our people would be confident to regularly invite their friends to something. But it's not 60%. No, it's not 80%. It's you're working often with, I think, 40% of people, and you've got to bear that in mind.
Dan's asking a question which I wonder comes out of, again, a church plant situation, because you guys would run your life courses at least sort of 4 times a year, I'm guessing, for each of your congregations.
Well, we run 3 times a year, and just to make that point very quickly, we run 3 times a year because you want to run frequently enough that you develop momentum, not so frequently that you bleed everyone dry of all their contacts, but also not during 4th term because follow-up is so important, and it's very hard to follow up adequately over Christmas. So we do something else in term 4. We run live 3 times during the year. So just there's a quick one, but moving on to whatever.
Now, if you were in a smaller setting and say you didn't have the resources, energy, or contacts to run it 3 times a year, let's say you could only run it once a year, any reflections on how to pick the time of year? You've already mentioned one. Don't run it in November and then everyone disappears on holidays. Any other pointers about if you could only run it once a year, when would you run it?
Oh, look, you want to run it where you've got something that you can build off. That is, you want to create a stepping stone from something to something else. So, you might, if a peak time for us is January, and it's a good time because people are not quite back in the work mode yet. They have disposable time. It kind of feels like holidays, at least on the Central Coast it does. Don't know about Tassie.
In Tassie, everyone is somewhere else. So if you ran it, you'd have to, You have to run it in a different city, I reckon.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They're on the Central Coast, maybe. Who knows?
On the Central Coast, run your Tasmanian evangelism up here. We'd love it.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
You'd run it after Easter. You'd run it after, something in January where you can build off. You want to run it after something where you can create some momentum. And I would, Dan, just to feedback there, I would try to run it twice a year if I could. Because once is a thing where you won't create enough expectation that it will be coming again soon. And you want
people to feel like, oh, bother, I should have brought a friend, that kind of thing, and then a chance to follow up on that feeling.
You want people to engage in their evangelistic conversations and think, I don't quite know what to do with this person next, unless they do, and wonderfully so, that they know what to do with the person next, but many don't. You want them, therefore, to be thinking, wonder when life has come out, it's coming up soon, I could invite them to that. And for that reason...
That's a helpful thing.
Won't quite do it once a year.
You're raising a really helpful pointer for us, and a take-home for the planter is to think, when you're thinking evangelism, don't just think the event, but think what's the next event after that event, and think what's the next event after that event. So you're always actually planning and in your calendaring, you're always calendaring your things in a natural flow-on way, aren't you? That's kind of what you're
totally
modelling to us.
And to pick up something there, not even so much what's the next event, but what's the next discipling stage, so that, with no word of a lie, and this may seem excessive, but our follow-up period lasts for 28, 30 weeks. Now, what that means is a person goes to an evangelistic event like, Summerfest, they hear about the summer series and they go to that. They come to Life, which is 6 weeks. Many of them express the fact they're converted, but they're almost certainly not. They then go to a 5-week follow-up course where they hear the gospel again. They don't recognise they've heard it again, but now they might be converted. They do a 5-week follow-up course on basic assurances. They do a 5-week follow-up on Christian living. They do a 5-week follow-up course on basic doctrine. They do a 3 weeks on how do I talk to my friends about the gospel. And getting toward the end of some of that, they're almost ready to join a growth group, but they're pretty much not ready before then.
Yeah.
They're just they feel so wet behind the ears and so lacking in the things that everyone else has got. So it takes a long time. So not so much next event always, but what's the next discipling step for them?
Yeah, great. Michael wants to know, you mentioned that confidence is one of those obstacles for the Christian to be, enthusiastic about mission. So how do we gauge that? Because, we may have Christians who, who know the right answer is, yes, I'm committed to evangelism, yes, I should invite people, but actually under the surface, they're not confident in the gospel, they're not confident in our church or our church's course. They may not even want to say that on an anonymous survey. Are there indirect ways that we can take the temperature on the confidence issue?
Oh, there are, but I reckon the first assumption, I think, which is, I hope this is not too pessimistic. I want it to be wise, not pessimistic. But Calvin would make the statement that that assurance of salvation is intrinsic to an understanding of the gospel. That is, if you grasp the gospel, assurance will be a lay down misere. But I think that's often not the case for people. That is to say, not that Calvin's wrong, but that people are so unclear in their grasp of the gospel that many of them aren't sure about salvation. And there's the first confidence issue to address. It's why actually setting up an evangelistic course so that your Christians will come matters, because a vast majority of people who come to ours actually express the fact, I thought I was a Christian, now I realise I'm not, and then make a commitment to faith and grow in Christian life. So there's the first thing. You need to assume that, I think it's wise to assume many people are not clear about salvation, and that's the first confidence issue to address. But secondly, that Christians do have a whole range of just apologetic confidence issues. I really don't know the answer to this myself. I really am not convinced that if I invite a friend it'll be good. I'm not sure what I would say if I was in this situation. I think you need to assume that's almost certainly the case with many people. And when you see people beginning to evangelise of their own volition without being pushed too much, when you see them showing up to pray for non-Christian friends or simply to pray in general, then I reckon you know that people have begun to grasp a decent conviction about the centrality and the wonder of the gospel. Does that make sense?
Great. Yeah, that's good. It's good. Peter wants to get any insights you might have on particularly engaging with men in evangelism.
Yeah, it's look, I think it's a great question to ask, because it is the case. I think that in Australia we readily don't engage men anywhere near as well as women, and part of those things are simply cultural. Women talk very much more than men do. They're much more likely to engage in issues that are meaningful. So I don't know that I've got lots I can say that is in any way revolutionary. We do seek to make sure that in our evangelism we put it on at a time where it's not going to bias the men, because then you are simply perpetuating something that's already exists in Australia, that most evangelism is set up for the women. So you do want to make sure, say in our Carols event, I keep saying we want to have it not on a Sunday, we want to have it on a Saturday, because we want the men to be able to come. We want life to be on a time where we're not going to run it in a state of origin.
Sunday night because of work the next day, is that what you're saying there?
I think they're less likely to. Yeah, I think they're less willing to come and sacrifice that time. You want to put it on a time that's prime for men. I don't put life on Wednesday nights during State of Origin. I put it on Tuesday night because now the Christians may say, "Straight, that's a concession," but I think because I'm seeking to win the lost. I know you guys will come, but and I'm very glad for that. But I want the non-Christian man there.
Yeah. The flip side then, which is funny that this is the next question with Adam going, if you're trying to evangelise couples, men and women, if there are kids involved, you can't get the couple necessarily get a babysitter and come out at night. So how do you manage, evangelising women, evangelising men when there's little kids in the mix?
Yeah. I think, this is a culture thing. So you talked about the ecosystem before, Mikey, and that's a big thing, I think, for us, that there are a lot of different things in church. Our growth groups, our announcements, our Sunday services, our AGM meetings, our all those sort of things have an evangelistic angle to them. So it is the case that I think the core of church, which for us is probably 30% of people, are so won to the desire to see the lost one that they babysit. They say, "You go, we look after your kids." And so there's not something we've set up to do that. In fact, I find it very hard to work out some sort of alternative arrangement. But we have done that from time to time. We've had the evangelistic event like Life running in one hall, and we've had a kind of modified kids program running next door. Hard to do when you're a smaller church and you don't have heaps of resources. That is heaps of people resources. So in those days, I think it just comes down to, which was the case for us in the early days, people would babysit and say to their non-Christian friends, "You go, have a great night, we'll look after the kids."
Yep. Are there any alarm bells you want to sound around building evangelistic along gender lines with adults, like running men's ministry evangelism and women's ministry evangelism? Are there any issues there?
No, we haven't done it none that I can speak to with any great authority. We haven't done it for a long time. That is to say, our women do run, they run a regular women's breakfast which has an evangelistic, it's accessible to the outsider. We have run men's events before at World Cup rugby time and, State of Origin and Grand Final and those kind of things. We have run that in the past, but we've not done it for a long time for various reasons. It's beyond me to actually take that one as well. But we actually have found we just got better fruit by doing it, by making it non-gender specific.
Yep. Okay. Chris is wondering, do you direct people to particular resources or apologetic material? Do you kind of have a recommended resources bookshelf or web page or something that you point people to?
There are things like that we point people to, but it wouldn't be a major plank in our evangelistic strategy. I think it is the case that I've been doing this so long that most of the questions people want to ask, they ask at life. So if we're talking about the non-Christian person, then they've got 30 weeks to ask all those questions. And over the years, we've trained a number of guys who are pretty good at dealing with those themselves. The rest of the Christian population, so there's the non-Christian, so there are books that we direct them to. So John Dixon writes wonderfully readable books that deal with some of the apologetic questions. But we deal with it with our non-Christians mostly by dealing with it in-house and answering the questions ourselves. And with the Christians, I think many of those have been to life and actually recognise there are answers to the questions they've been hiding for a long time or have not. Yep. They haven't been sufficiently on the tip of their consciousness to ask, and so they recognise that life's the place to get them answered, and they'll either come to life or they'll ask me. Or our other guys who run life, like Jez, etc.
Now, sadly, we've only got 2 more questions, and I just wanted to express appreciation to everyone for having such awesome questions flooding in. Sorry we couldn't get to them all. I guess we'd be very keen as and when we're able to help you get in touch with Craig or others to get your questions answered outside of this webinar time. But for now, Peter is wanting to know, how do you gain momentum when you have a high turnover? Say work commitments, mining town is his example, where you're losing and gaining 35% of your congregation every year, and people normally stay for 3 years.
Yeah. How do you gain momentum? Yes.
Yeah.
Now, recognising that's not my context, so thinking into it as a complete punter, right, who's got no expertise in this at all. So I'm flying a kite here. If I was in that kind of context, I think I'd run the course, which I've recognised. I've suggested to a couple of other guys in the past. I think I'd run the course that's set up as the entry-level course for church. But I'd have an evangelistic edge to it so that you can do exactly what we're trying to do with life. Run a series that helps the Christian while it's directed toward the non-Christian. Do you know what I mean? Because you want to be able to say to the Christian who's coming in for just the 3-year period of time, this would be so good for you that you don't want to miss it.
Yep.
And I think we've actually done that with life. I think most of our people who come new into church say this is the best thing we've ever done.
Yep.
Now, if I was living in that kind of mining town, I'd simply play up that point a little bit more. That is, I'd ensure that at every step the Christian doesn't think this is irrelevant to me. It's for the unconverted. You want them to think it's relevant. And one of the ways in which you do that is you You decisively deal with the issues of sin, repentance, the atonement, some of the apologetic questions. You drill into them rather deeply, and you'll find that many of your people who come professing Christian life are not deep enough on some of those things, and it will change their life to be deepened.
Yeah, great. It's an interesting thought, Craig, that maybe you've got, if this 3-year cycle, your whole ministry shape, in a sense, is flavoured by sustaining momentum for believer and insider alike. That's just one really quickly, if we can squeeze this in before we close off for the hour. Lee is wondering what place this, if training is a key aspect to reducing fear in people bringing friends, how much should this evangelistic training be a place amongst the core team phase of your church plan?
Well, great question. Whether it's effective training or not, it's critical to do in the core phase of establishing a church, because it will set the DNA for what your church is about. So, whether it was me or Andrew in the early days, Andrew Hurd is so thoroughly evangelistically minded that people would have got from him what they'd get from me. And whether the training will be such that people remember for the rest of their lives the 6 boxes of 2 ways to live, what they will get is the evangelistic commitment and DNA of the church that I'm coming to is profound, and I want to get on board with that. Now, having said that, there is useful training you can do. There's useful training that will actually stick, but my observation is it will only stick as much as it's being used. I hate to be pessimistic about that, but that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great, Craig. Look, we're out of time. Again, it's been just nice having an excuse to spend some time with you, Craig, and I reckon everyone's gotten a lot out of this last hour or so.
No, great to catch up with you, Mikey. Really good. Enjoyed all the questions there. They're thoughtful.
Yeah, all the best to everyone else, and don't hesitate to get in touch via Geneva if there are things your question didn't get answered, and I'm sure Craig will do his best to get to it at some point. Over to you, Mark, our event organiser.
Good day, Mark.
Hey guys, and thanks very much on behalf of the team over here at Geneva. We've been doing the best we can to actually keep up with the questions of flooding in. Mikey, you're absolutely right. What we will do is take all of the questions that weren't answered, and we're going to just give Craig too much work to do for the next week, put them in an email and see if he can't give us a couple of sentences on each of them. We'll then post that with the webinar, which will be going up, shortly. Craig's answers, let's give him a little more time for the week. His answers might come next week. But that said, everybody, we've just had great fun trying to field everything through. Mikey's had great fun trying to give them in, and mainly, most of all, you've made it a time that's beneficial for you. So that's something that's what the whole point of the planner sessions are about. We hope you've benefited from this particular planner session. And before we sign off, I actually want to direct you to the next planner session, which is actually up on our website now, so that you can go and learn all about or sign up, be ready to talk to Eugene Hoare and Al Stewart. They'll be covering webinar, the multicultural ministry, what's missing in Australia. And you'll be able to find that in our events column from tomorrow. There'll be a big banner up on the page, so you won't be able to miss it. But really, multicultural Australia is a factor of any church planting mission today. So you really do need to be prepared. And you've got to ask yourself, am I actually across the cultures that will actually be interacting with our ministry? And so in that case, get your questions ready. Al and Eugene will be online to take care of that in about a month's time on April 15. That one will be in the morning, guys, so just make sure you're available for the morning at 9:30 a.m. And also, before we finish, I really should say thank you to the guys at EA Insurance, who basically made this planter session ministry possible. Everyone over there has basically put their support behind this program, and we'd like to thank them. EA helps out hundreds of Christian community not-for-profits with their insurance needs. So if you have insurance questions for your church plant, Geneva recommends you get in contact with them. ea.org.au, first step, probably the best thing you'll do inside of insurance. On behalf of our guests, Craig Dobbie and Mikey, our host, as well as the team at Geneva Push, my name's Mark Hadley, and we hope you have had a great day, and thank you for joining us and taking time to view the presentation.